Started. Obviously, like Matt says, this is really covering a better integration between Dynamics 365 and SharePoint using Power Automate. It's a fairly packed session, so I will try and take questions, but hopefully we'll get through a lot, and I'll be around for the rest of the day as well. Yeah, I guess first thing is just for like all these events, just want to say thank you to the sponsors. They're all listed here. I'm sure if you ask Andy, maybe or Scott or anybody, they'll give you a link to each of them. And if you don't see your logo up there and think that'd be really nice, contact Gretchen. I'm sure she'll be happy to take your money off you. So without sponsors, none of this can happen. A little quick bit about myself. I'm a CRM/D365 functional consultant for a financial services company based up in Edinburgh. As you can tell from my accent, I am Scottish. So that means I tend to talk relatively quickly, and I get quite excited when I do these presentations. So if you do find that I'm speaking too quickly, please just like shout out in the chat, and I'm sure Matt will shout at me. At the bottom of the screen there, you'll see links to my socials on LinkedIn and on Twitter at Ryan Maclean 365. Also my blog, which is ryanmaclean365.com, where I vlog relatively frequently, and I've covered most of the content that I'll be talking about today on there. And at the end of the session, I'll post the links up and we'll share that at the end. So in today's agenda, I'm going to cover 5 main points. So the first thing is really talking about the standard integration between Dynamics and SharePoint, because I guess if I'm going to talk about something better, I need to explain what I'm improving on. Secondly, covering that custom integration in terms of site provisioning using Power Automate and some basic Azure Automation. Thirdly, creating custom document libraries, either from Dynamics 365 or from SharePoint, and being able to visualize them in both. Fourthly, synchronizing permissions between a Dynamics 365 access team and a SharePoint group, and finally synchronizing an Active Directory security group between Dynamics 365 and SharePoint. So first things first, talking about the standard integration. So for those of you who've been using Dynamics for a while and using SharePoint, hopefully you've probably experienced the integration, but if you've not, when you go to your settings and document management, either from your Dynamics advanced settings or from your Power Platform admin portal, you can enable server-side SharePoint integration. And when you do that, it asks you to pop your SharePoint site link in the bottom, and then it asks you to select which entities you want to enable for document management, and you'll see a link. When you do that, what it does is on your default site, it creates a document library per entity that you're using. And then when you then create records or enable records for document management, it creates a folder for those. So you got your site, document library per entity, a folder per record, and then all of the documents. And then when you go to, excuse me, when you go to your Dynamics 365 record and you click on the Files tab, you'll see this document grid. So in terms of that integration, I really love that almost seamless experience of being able to click on to the Files tab and see your files that are located in SharePoint. SharePoint's great for document management. It's certainly much better than Dynamics is ever going to be. And I love that kind of native integration. What I don't like, and any of you who have any experience with SharePoint or are SharePointers, I don't really know what the collective term for SharePoint people is. You're probably putting your head in your hands at how that integration works, because having like, if you think about enterprise scale, having a single site for all of that, it just seems unmanageable. And also one of my biggest frustrations, and one of the reasons that led me to doing all this custom integration, is that you've got this phenomenally complicated and incredible security model in Dynamics 365, and you can lock down records and say only nominated people can see this record in my system. And then you integrate with SharePoint, and none of that security is replicated. And so you've got, in my financial services kind of organization, we have loads of kind of conflicts of interest we have to manage, and so we have to make sure that people can't see things they're not supposed to see and can't access it. And so we can lock all that down in Dynamics, but if we just had the standard integration, they could go to SharePoint and see all those documents, and you can imagine what a nightmare that is. And I know certainly from my experience, we have around about 800 clients who each have an individual site, and all of our projects have individual sites and all of our opportunities. And so if you had all of those as just document libraries and folders within a single site, performance would be just terrible. And while you can manage security at file level or folder level, SharePoint best practice dictates that you manage security at site level. So that really was the kind of launching point for what I'm trying to do with this. And so moving on to the kind of custom integration, before I get started, there was a couple of really key things. So one was that I wanted to have a unique reference ID for this, and that's what I'm going to use for my site URL. And the reason I've gone for that rather than the account name is that account names change. You know, M&A mergers and acquisitions lead to account names changing, or companies deciding they want to refresh. And so if we had the URL with just a specific account name, it would quickly fall out of fashion and you'd have to go through all this kind of site restructure, whereas having a persistent unique ID, just using an auto number field, makes my life a little bit easier. And then in terms of that SharePoint site provisioning, I've just gone for 4 fields. So one is create SharePoint site. It's just a 2-option field, and that's the trigger for my flow, which I'll get onto in just a second. The SharePoint site status just lets me see if the SharePoint site is being created, or if it's active, or if we've archived it. The SharePoint site URL, not strictly necessary, but it's useful for me. So when I provision the site, I then pop the URL into there, and then I can use that in subsequent flows. And then the site created on date time is just really, again, for a bit of metadata to say, when was that site created? What I will say is my presentation today is almost exclusively live demos. I have made my sacrifices to demo gods. I've run through it like 4 times this morning and it's all been working. So if you just, cross your fingers and pray to your deity of choice, I'd really appreciate it. If you do have questions at any point, please pop them in the chat. We'll hopefully get through them as we go through the session. And if not, we'll wrap up at the end. And like I say, I'll be around all day. So let me come out of this and I will move across to here. So as I said, I've got, excuse me, my record here, and I'm going to, I'll click this button in a second, but what I'll do is I'll show you the flows. So this flow, when it loads, there we go. So this flow uses some Azure Automation, and I'll jump onto that in just a second, but I think it's relatively straightforward. So the trigger is just when that create SharePoint site field is triggered to yes. So the filter and attribute is just for that field. And then the filter expression is just when that equals true, to make sure that it only triggers when it's actually set to yes. Once we do that, we then go through and list the default SharePoint sites. So when you set up that default integration between Dynamics 365 and SharePoint, it takes that base URL and it sets that as a default. And so all I'm doing here is I'm using some fetch XML, using a list record step, and I'm saying I want to find SharePoint sites where that is default equals the value 1, i.e. equals yes, and that'll give me the back. And because I know I'm only going to get one value back from that, because I'm only ever going to have one default site, rather than then using a apply to each for this, I can use this expression, a first expression, to go through it. So I'm using first on the outputs, and from the body or value, I want to get that absolute URL. And what that'll give me as an output is the base URL for my default SharePoint site. And then from there, I'm going to say that I want my site URL for my new SharePoint site I'm creating to be that base URL /sites, which is my managed path. And if you're familiar with SharePoint, you've only got 2 managed paths in SharePoint Online, either /sites or /teams. So I'm putting in the sites managed path, and then I'm taking that unique reference ID that I created, and then I'm going to go and create an Azure Automation job. And so the Azure Automation is relatively straightforward. So first things first, we need to make sure we've got a subscription and a resource group, and we've created an automation account, and then we'll create a runbook. So let me close that a second. So when I've got it in, I've got my automation account here, and then I've gone to create a runbook. The runbook uses PowerShell, and I'm not a coder. My background is I studied law at uni, so I'm massively geeky, but I'm not a coder. And so if you're like, oh my God, I don't know about PowerShell, that's fine, because this uses graphical PowerShell, which I'd never heard of until I started experimenting with this. I'm going to click on edit here. What will happen is you get this kind of canvas, and then you can just drag and drop elements on it. So I've got a commandlet that I can run on here. And so if I look through the commandlets and search for you'll see that they've got SharePoint PnP PowerShell Online, and then it's got a whole load of commandlets in here. So the first thing I need to do is I need to connect to it. Nice and straightforward. Then I want to create a SharePoint tenant site. So there's one called new PnP tenant site. Couldn't be easier. And in here, what's great is it tells you which parameters that you can configure in it. And when you hover over the parameters, it'll tell you if it's required or not. So for me, I'm taking the site title, which I set as an input. Sorry, I should have covered that. You've got inputs and outputs here. And you can just say, I want my input parameters to be this, and that's what you'll have to put in from your flow. So I'm just putting in the URL and the title. And so let me just get back to that. And I'm popping the title into here. I'm making sure the time zone is 2, which is UTC. I'm setting owner to myself, although you could set that dynamically to whoever you want to be. I'm setting the site URL to be that URL that I've created, and I've set the template just to be a kind of standard site page publishing one. Was that question for PnP? It's basically PnP is like plug and play. So as far as I'm aware, so it's in there. Once we've created that tenant site, I also want to register it as a hub site. And the reason I want to use it as a hub site is because I have like opportunities and projects and lots of other stuff that I'll have related to this site. So rather than using a nested site structure, which is not SharePoint best practice, we use a hub site. So we create the hub site and then we can connect these other sites almost like spokes into the hub. And that means we can reparent them later if we ever need to. So by registering as a hub site, any child sites I can then link to that hub and then I just disconnect. So like I said, my knowledge of PowerShell is limited. And if I tried to do this writing from PowerShell, I would have a real struggle. But I was able to configure this in, probably about a couple of hours of just playing and testing, and just testing the parameters and seeing what I needed to do with it. So hopefully you've kind of caught up to speed with it. I have covered this in a bit more detail on my blog, but obviously with time pressures, I'm trying to cover it as quickly as I can. So once we've done that, we can then go back into our flow. And like I say, we create the job. The key thing here is I'm picking the runbook and then I'm saying I'm going to wait for the job. And the reason I wait for the job is what it happens is when this goes to trigger it, it then says, I'm going to wait until I get an output back from this, and then I'll carry on with the flow. And that just lets me see if there's been any errors, whatever. I can put some kind of catches in here. And like I said, with the runbook parameters, I set my site URL and site title up there. And so it's just asked me for those. So it'll go and create the site. Once we've done that, I'm then going to update my account and just scroll all the way down, and I've popped in my site created on, set the site status to active, and set that site URL. And then I create a SharePoint site record in Dynamics 365 for that. So I can then create that SharePoint site record using that URL that I've created. And I've popped a description, just say it's created by Flow. And then underneath that, I'm going to create a document location. So when you create a SharePoint site, you always get a default document library called shared documents. And so I just make sure that I've set the names of the documents, that it's SharePoint. I've set that parent or site location to be the one that I've just created above. And I've set the regarding to my account that I've triggered this from. And then my relative URL is shared documents. And that's it. And so if I go back to my account here and just switch this to yes, this will take a few seconds to run. Yeah. I'll go back to my flow. That wasn't handy. While this is running, I see there's a couple of questions. So I think, Reese, I can see you've asked a question about the licensing cost implication of using Azure Automation. It costs relatively nothing. So we've been running in my organization for a while, and it's like fractions of a penny per run of an Azure Automation job. So we've not found any issues with running it that way. But I guess, depending on your own environment.
Okay, but you do have to have a pay-as-you-go or some sort of subscription.
Yeah, you'd have to have a subscription to it, yeah.
Okay.
To make sure you run it. But yeah, so if I go back here, just running. Yeah, so this job will start in the background and it'll run, and I'll come back to it in a few minutes just to check that that it has worked. So the next step in here is moving on to creating document libraries. So once you've created a site, you probably want to do something for your document management. So in my organization, we tend to have document libraries for specific things. So if you've got contracts, we'll put all those in one, or if we've got client communications, we'll put them in one, or if we've got reports, we'll put them in a document library, and that just helps us to kind of segregate that data. And so what I wanted to do was enable users to create a document library either from the Dynamics 365 record or from SharePoint. So I've got two separate kind of on-demand flows that I'll run for that, and I'll go through those in a second, and hopefully by the time I get to the end of the first one, our site will be provisioned, and if not, I'll go to a different site. So if I go to here, so when I create a new document library, what I'm doing is using the when a record is selected, and so this is from the kind of the old Common Data Service connector, which allows you to run these effectively on-demand flows. And so all I'm saying is when a record is selected from accounts and I want to create a document library, and what I love about this compared to the old kind of on-demand workflows is you can set an input. And so all I'm asking a user for is to give me a document library name, and then we'll use that to go and create the document library against the SharePoint site. So the first thing we do is we get the related SharePoint site for the account. And so what I'm saying here is I want SharePoint sites where the absolute URL for that SharePoint site equals the SharePoint site URL from my account. So where I've got like the site URL here, if I look at my SharePoint sites, just for those of you who are not familiar, you'll have an absolute URL in it. And so it just allows you to make sure that you can see to find the right one, because they're all going to be unique. I might go back. Hopefully this is the one. Yeah, so that's gone and created that SharePoint site that we triggered before, which is great because it'll allow us to trigger the next bit. So we're going to find that SharePoint site. Again, just as before, I'm using that first expression because I don't want a kind of an irrelevant loop in the system. So I'm just saying, because I know I'm going to get one value back, give me the first one and give me that SharePoint site ID because I want that unique GUID, because I'll use that when I create the document location. Next, I'm using the send HTTP request to SharePoint connector, and that uses the SharePoint REST API. And so I'm saying I want to create a new document library on this site. So I'm using a post method, BRI. The SharePoint REST API documentation on the Microsoft Docs site is incredible. I'd highly recommend reading it. It basically gives you almost exactly what you need. So we pop our headers in here, which is just saying I'm sending JSON. I want JSON back effectively. I think Scott DeRose on the call. He probably knows more about REST APIs than I'm ever going to know in my life. So if you've got specific questions about that, please direct them at him because he's much cleverer than I am. When I'm creating a document library, I'm then saying I want it to be a type of SharePoint list. So in SharePoint, you've also got list views and then you've got document libraries. And it turns out document library is just a fancy list. I hadn't realized that before. So I'm creating a SharePoint list and I'm setting the base template to be 101, which says that's a document library. And then I'm setting the title to be whatever that input was from my trigger. And then once I've created that, I'll create a document location record back in Dynamics 365 against my account. So I'm creating document location that has the title, the same title for my trigger. And I'm saying that the relative URL is what that was. So I'll set the parent or site location to that output, the ID that I got above, and set the regarding to my account ID that I triggered this from. So if I go back to here, and just so we can see, at the moment we've only got one document location called documents, but if I trigger my flow, document library, apologies, bear with me. I'll just call it contract. And I click run flow. This will just take a second or two to run. Back a second. Easy me now. This will run in the background, but it will create our document location, hopefully for us. I'll come back to it. But that creates a document location for us. And if we go to our SharePoint site, silence sounds so loud in my ear. We'll see the document library appear here. I'll come back and check on it in a second. The next one is that we want to sync our document libraries back to the site. So what we're doing there is we're just saying if we've created a document library directly on here, I want to be able to sync that back to my record. So what happens occasionally is a user will come into here and say, well, I actually want to create my own document library in here. And that won't be visible on our Dynamics 365 record, which is not ideal for us, obviously. So we want to be able to visualize this back in the record. So if I was to go back here and look at my related files, I want to be able to see all of the locations that are available. And it's not going to be there. So what I can do is go to my flow and then sync my document libraries. And this will run this flow to sync it back. And I'll go through the steps in that one as soon as I trigger this. That's not the right one. I think I picked the wrong one. But what it's basically the same idea. So I'm getting my related SharePoint site. same with my absolute URL equals my site URL. I'll get that site ID using that first expression that I used before, because I'm only getting one value back. I then use the get all lists and libraries, which is just a standard action in the SharePoint connector from that site. And then for my Dynamics 365 record, I'm going to list all of the related document locations. So the SharePoint document location is related to that. So I'm saying that regarding object ID equals my account. From that, I'm going to select the name, the relative URL, and the regarding ID. And then I'm going to, and the reason I use the select really is just because when you trigger this list records step, you get a lot of just a massive JSON output, and it's full of a lot of, I guess, what I would call extraneous nonsense and stuff that I'm not interested in. And so for the sake of kind of making my life a bit easier for debugging, I use the select step so I can see the key values I'm looking for. And then what I'm doing here is for each list or library that was returned here, I'm then going to check from the list that's here, are all the values in here? So basically, if I've got like 5 document libraries, it'll go through them and say, does that appear in the list in Dynamics 365? If it does not, then create a new document location for it. It's really as straightforward as that. So if you think that you've got like 5 document libraries in SharePoint and you've only got 4 visible in Dynamics 365, when it gets to the one that's not visible, it'll say, oh, that doesn't appear in your list of records from Dynamics. So let's go and create a document location for it. And then update our record just to say that we've set our document library sync to true. So relatively straightforward to do. And I'll make sure my flows are actually running here. Not sure why this one's not running, but we'll come back to it. Anybody got any more questions at this point? Let's see what time we're at. So Sophie asked how it impacts the database storage in terms of the data being stored in SharePoint. So it actually for the files that you're looking at, they'll be stored against your file storage in Dynamics 365. Obviously, under the capacity model, you tend to have a lot more file storage. But I know for my organization, our SharePoint database is 2.5 terabytes. And so thinking about how much that would cost me for Dynamics 365 storage gets me palpitations. I'm sure it would for anybody who's covering licensing for you as well. So SharePoint storage is on an order of magnitude cheaper than Dynamics storage. So that's why we're using that SharePoint connector, because, and also in terms of document management generally, that's what SharePoint's designed for. So I would much rather kind of pop it off there in the first place. So that's really why we're looking at it, is one, that it is cost effective, but 2, that we're using the tool that's best designed for that purpose. It's, using the best tool for its purpose, rather than trying to kind of budget together with what you have in Dynamics, because SharePoint allows kind of co-authoring, it allows version control, and lots of other kind of nice functions around that. And John Clark, he's asked if we ever see the document, the creation of document library fail via the REST API. As of yet, I've not seen it fail. So I need to do probably more testing. If you're saying you're finding it fail, I'm not too sure why it would. It shouldn't do. I guess if you're running a lot concurrently, it might cause issues, but I haven't found any issues with concurrency to date. But I'll certainly have a look at that. And then Jessica Howes has asked whether we're setting up these individual sites to gain greater security over them. So security and visibility of documents can be controlled through Office 365 settings. But I guess if you think about, again, thinking about my organization, we've got something like 12,500 sites. Trying to manually manage those while also having to manually manage your Dynamics 365 records just seems crazy, because they're never going to be in sync, because somebody's going to screw up. I think, humans being what we are, we're fallible. So we try and automate as much as that's possible and have a single source of truth. So the way we set it up, and I'll get onto the permissions syncing in just a second, is to try and make sure that the permissions are as synchronized as they can be between Dynamics 365 and SharePoint. And so that's why we set up the individual sites, is so we can control that security kind of much more granularly, and try and reduce the amount that users need to do. And then for Luke, he's asked about using the Azure Automation to create the SharePoint site, but the SharePoint connector to create the SharePoint library. So the reason I used Azure Automation to create the SharePoint site is that if you try and use the standard SharePoint connector, it'll only allow you to create a subsite. You can't create a site collection. And so that's a real issue for us, is because we don't want subsites. And if you read anything with SharePoint best practice, they recommend a flat structure, not a nested structure. And so we wanted to make sure we could create site collections under the managed path, rather than having it being like, your SharePoint /sites /one site /another site. We want them all under the managed path, and we're using that hub site to manage that. So that's why we've gone down the route of using Azure Automation. At the moment, you can only create sites under the managed path using PowerShell, and the only way I could use that was using Azure Automation. So that was the reason why I went that way. So what I'm going to do next is move on to synchronizing permissions. So if I go back to my SharePoint integration here, what you'll see is I've got an access team set up. And so the way we set it up in our organization is basically that users only have access to, at user level, or for the records they create, and then we manage access to that via access teams. And so we'll add them to the access team here to grant them access to the record, and then we can synchronize that to SharePoint. And so the way I do that is, if I go into edit here, so this is probably the longest flow that I've got. Is first of all, I've got that field that just says sync with SharePoint. And so all I'm doing is setting my filtering attributes, and this is using the common data service current environment connector. So I set my filtering attribute to that field and make sure my filter expression is that is true, because I set that back to false at the end when we sync it. Once I've done that, I then find that related access team. And so the access team is controlled by the system, but it has a regarding object ID. So access teams are always set to regarding a record. So I'm saying, give me the teams, and I only have one access team template for this. So if you had two, because you only have a maximum of two, you'd have to set specifically which template you're using for the purpose of this. I'm not, so it's a relatively straightforward fetch XML expression. So I'm saying, give me a team where the regarding object ID is an account, and the account ID is the account that I've just triggered this from. And then again, just using that first expression is probably my favorite thing, because I don't want those the loops that you tend to get for the list record step. I'm just saying, give me that team ID for the GUID. And then I'm querying the team memberships entity. So if you ever look for the entity name, that won't appear, but you can put it in manually and you'll find it. And what I'm saying for there is, for the team membership, I want to find team memberships where the team ID equals that team ID I've just got up top. And I want to get a system user ID, and I want their internal email address, because when you add people to SharePoint, you need their domain email address. And so that's what we're using here. And then again, I'm just using a select action, because I'm not interested in the rest of the JSON. I just want a list of the emails. Next, what I want to make sure is I can find my SharePoint members group. So just for the sake of clarity, when you create a SharePoint site, you get an owners group, a members group, and a visitors group. So I want to be able to find this members group, because that's the one I'm going to add people to. So the first thing I'm going to do is just initialize an empty variable, and then I'm going to get all groups, and this is just using a simple get action, which is get and then all site groups. From that, I'm going to parse that JSON, which is just taking that body content, and then I'm going to look through that, and I'm going to say, does the title end with members? Because if I just go back here a second, I'll do. Is you'll see that when it creates them for us, so I've done nothing to create these, the members group ends with members, which makes my life easier. So I'm saying, if it ends with members, then I want the ID of that group. Once I've got that ID, then I'm using another get action to say, I want a list of all the users with their email addresses from that SharePoint site. So just to kind of recap there, I've got a list of all the groups. I found that members group ID, and then I'm getting a list of all the members who are in that group. Once I've got that, I'm just going to take all of the JSON from there, and I'm going to just do a compose step and set it to a string output off the body from that previous one. And then what I do for each CRM user, so just going back above, where I've got all these CRM users above, I'm going to look through each of those. I'm going to take their email address, which is just taking that an email address field from them, and I'm going to just see, are they in this list of SharePoint team members. And if they're not, I'm going to add them to that SharePoint team. So I'm using that site URL that we created before, using a post to add them to that SharePoint members group as a user. And we use this login name. So this kind of prefix is what SharePoint needs to say that we're going to add them, and I'm adding them by their email address. This, if I'm being honest, took me a little while to get right, and I did a lot of Googling and checking on like Stack Overflow and things, but it tends to work. I'm not sure exactly what this means. I'm sure I've had my SharePoint lead explain it to me several times, but it is absolutely required to add people to SharePoint. So you need their login name, and it has to be their email address. I don't know why SharePoint doesn't use domain IDs. It confuses me. But that will add the CRM users to that SharePoint team. And then the next thing we need to do is just go through our SharePoint team, just for the sake of clarity, and say, is there anybody in the SharePoint team who shouldn't be there because they're no longer in the CRM team? And so it's just going to do the same as we did above. It's going to say, is the person from that SharePoint team in that list of CRM users? If they're not, let's get their user ID. So we just do a get by email because you need their email address. And then we're going to remove that user from the group, again, using a post action to say we're removing them by their user ID. And so that's why we do that. We get this user ID, and this gives them their ID. And I'll run this in a second and show you how it works. And then finally, we just update our account to set our last team sync date to the time now, and at my sync, I've lost my base sync with SharePoint to no. So if I go back to this account, let's add a couple of users to it. Add and so you can see here, I've got 3 people who've got access to this record, but if I go to the related SharePoint site, they're not going to be in the list of members. So what we want to do is just tick the sync. I really need to turn off duplicate detection in this tenant. And so that'll go ahead and do the sync. And so if I go back to, yeah, that's fine. And that one's succeeded already, which is good. So if I go back to my Coho Winery, close that. We can see that they've appeared in here, which is great. So that's exactly what we wanted. I've added them to Dynamics 365 and added to SharePoint. Now they can see both. And so if I look through the list here, and again, I've covered some blog posts, which I'll get to at the end, because I appreciate there's quite a lot of kind of weird kind of doing a couple of loops in there, but it makes sense. And you can see it's pretty performant, but it checks for each user, are they in the SharePoint team? And obviously none of them are. And then it's added them to that SharePoint team using the simple, here's my site, I'm posting it, I found that group ID is 5. In my experience, almost always the members group is group 5, but occasionally it's not. And that's why I've got this kind of search to find the members group ID. I've added them by their login name. And if I was to update this, I'm to say I'm going to remove Batman. I'm going to add a different user. Just refresh this form. You can see obviously that it also set this back to no, but if I set this to yes again, then this will go and do that syncing of a team. It'll take slightly longer now because it's doing a couple of loops, but it will then hopefully sync the users back up properly. And if I go back to Coho Winery, then you can see it's updated the membership again. So the reason I think this is useful is it allows users to manage your security from just your Dynamics record, and it'll just sync it back to SharePoint. I guess the slight frustration is it has to be manually triggered. At the moment, I don't think you can set a SharePoint, you can't set a flow to trigger from an end-to-end associate or dissociate message, which is a bit frustrating, but it's, it's a simple enough workaround. You could set it on a schedule if you wanted to kind of make sure that it ran in sync. It's still going to be slightly asynchronous, but but useful nonetheless. And so I think there's a couple more questions who are popping up here. Alex asked what the advantage using D365 teams here rather than business units. The reason that we're using teams rather than business units is really because that even within the context of a business unit, not everybody's going to have access to something. So we're using access teams to specifically control. So I know in my organization, we have cross-departmental teams. And so we have people in different business units trying to do it. And so using access teams just allows us to kind of to control it that way. It's using system functionality for what it's designed for. And so that's what we've done. The last kind of step that I want to cover then is allowing all users to access it. Sometimes we just allow all. And so what I've got is I've called the SharePoint permissions, but really it's permissions. I'm saying, do I want to allow all users to access this and then therefore also access the SharePoint record or restrict it to just these users? And I'll set this to all users for a second. And I've got a quick flow for that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a Azure an Azure Active Directory group called my SharePoint Integration users. And so because it's a security group, what's great is we can then take this object ID, it's good, and we can create an Azure Active Directory security group team in Dynamics. And so that membership is then dynamically managed from Azure, which is awesome. And then I want to be able to sync that with my SharePoint site. So this is the last one. So when that field is updated, again, it's just that permissions. I'm going to get the integration group name, which I know is always going to be that. It's a fixed value. I'm going to do the same thing again to get my members group. So get all groups, parse that JSON and look through it to find the group that equals members because I need that. And then I'm going to check, is the permission set to all users? So if I just go back here, is it set to all users? If it is, I'm going to add this team. If not, then it's not. So if it is, we're going to add that integration group. So what we do is for the site, we do the site groups for that group that we've got. And then we add this login name. And you can see this is slightly different than what we had before. But we're adding that group by the group ID. And again, because I know that group ID is fixed, I'm putting a fixed value there. Generally not a fan of putting fixed values in flows. I like everything to be dynamic, but I know this group ID is never going to change. So that's why it's in there. And then finally, I use a grant access action to share it with my team. So again, my team ID is going to be a fixed value. You know, if I look on this team, where's my? I'm just taking this value. I'm popping that into my flow, and then I'm saying that the OData type is team, and I'm saying the access method, I want to give them read access and write access. The only thing to note here is using this, this is performing an unbound action, is that for whatever reason, it struggles with using the @ symbol. So I've just put it inside a string expression to make sure it works, because otherwise it fails out. You can escape it with doing a double @ but I find that when you save it, sometimes when you come back, that second @ disappears. So by doing it this way, just make sure it makes my life a bit easier. It's a weird kind of quirk with the system, but that's what works. If the site check permission was set just to the access team only, I'm doing the same thing, but I'm just getting a list of all users by their title. I'm going to do a parse JSON on that because then I can look through them. I'm going to check for that integration group. And so if the title of the user is that integration group name, I'm just going to do a post to remove that user. So get by ID and then remove by that user's ID and then unshare it. And so what you'll find is that because I set that to all users, if I go to share, which here, there we go. It's shared it with that group. And if I go back to my Cocoa Winery one and click share, what you'll see is it shared it. Every member of that group then inherits the permissions to view this record or edit this record through that. And if I update this to access team only, that'll take a second to run if I go back. Yeah. And if I look again here, it's going to it's kind of unshared this record with that team, so it's not shared anymore. If I go back to here and do that, it's unshared it with them here. So it allows us to use Azure Active Directory groups, which is great because we don't then need to manage team membership in two separate places. It's just all handled through Active Directory, which is really useful for us because we have specific groups. And I think that's covered everything I wanted to get through in 45 minutes, which is great. And so, like I said, I do have links on here to all of the blog posts, and I'll happily kind of post these links in the bottom, but they're all on my website, just ryanmaclean365.com. They're also all on there just under a SharePoint integration category, so I'll pop the link in the chat to that to make sure you can see it. And anybody got any questions? Happy for you to come off mute and kind of shout at me now.
Isn't the silence loud?
So I appreciate there's quite a lot to cover in there and a lot of detail. In terms of the SharePoint REST API stuff for that send HTTP request, like I said, I used the SharePoint docs site quite heavily for that because there's quite a lot of detail in there covering each of the REST API actions. And then anything I wasn't too sure about, I used my Google Foo to kind of go and find where people have done something similar, and it's just a lot of trial and error for me. So like I said, I've covered all the detail of what each of the bits mean in that, but my background, like I say, isn't in computer geekery, and I've managed to do it. So I'm sure anybody else on it has been able to, would be able to work this out. But if you do have any specific questions, obviously happy to take them if I've not covered them already.
Well done, Ryan. It sounds like go on.
Yeah, you mentioned, I'm a bit confused. You mentioned integration group,
Yep.
access SharePoint member group, and then access team in SharePoint. Is it direct flow from?
In terms of the access team to flow, yeah. So basically, let me get rid of this. So this access team, all it does is basically, I'm using an access team template. So if I sorry, I'll wait for this to catch up on me. So if I go to my security settings, and I can set an access team template for that team, and that allows me then to dictate what permission that's given. And then the flow that I went through, which is the syncing team permissions, then takes each of the people. So anybody who's in this, it takes them and adds them to the SharePoint members group. And so it just does that sync between the two. The integration group is an Azure Active Directory group, and that's doing slightly different.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else get any questions?
Luke, is that the 5 points on his slide deck? I'm sure Ryan will share his slide deck as well at some point on this that's got those links on that for you.
Yeah, I'll happily kind of pop the slide deck up, but if you're wanting the link to all of the posts, they're just on the website under SharePoint integration category, and that'll cover kind of all of the details. So quite a long list in there, but there's quite a lot of detail in each of them. So but yeah, the slide deck, I'm sure Andy will be sharing those as well.
Yeah, they'll be put online.
Yeah. So Megan just asked if we went into this. Yeah, we have. So where all this came from is we had a custom integration that was built by a previous SharePoint partner that used a whole load of plugins and a lot of C#. And like I said, I'm not a coder, so I found it frustrating that I couldn't do any debugging when it started to go wrong. Really struggled, and so one of our big things internally was trying to make sure that everything was as kind of using native tools or as out of the box as possible. And so between myself and my colleagues who work on the SharePoint side of the business, we developed all of this internally, and we've deployed it.
Wonderful. Thank you for that, Ryan. I was
Yeah,
while
right.
you were talking, sorry, I was spamming links to the next point.
Yeah, that's fine.
Everyone knows where they're going because no one quite can navigate the internet today.
Yeah, like I say, I will be around for the rest of the day. On and off, I'll probably be in the lobby. But if you do have any questions, obviously, like I said, I'm on Twitter at RyanMaclean365. I'm RyanMaclean365 on LinkedIn, and I'm on my website. So you can obviously get in touch with me any way there.
Thank you.
Yeah, virtual round of applause for this is what would be happening if people could see.
Cheers, Matt.
There you go. There
We
you
play
go.
a clapping
Good.
sound at the end. That sounds like someone let their kid loose.
Good. Well, thanks for attending, guys.